Welcome to Making a Difference. Today we have a very special guest, Werner Frank. He has an extremely interesting background. I'm excited about hearing more about his history. He was born in Germany, and he and his family left in 1937 to come to the United States. He has been involved for many years in the technology area of business and has also been very philanthropic, and that's why he's here today. Werner, I'd like to ask you, who in your life was a role model that helped you learn and become so motivated to be involved in philanthropic activities?
That's an easy question to answer. I had a young mentor. His name was Samuel Kamaker, Sam, in Chicago. I was very active in the Jewish youth movement at that time. We had something called the Jewish Youth League, which had chapters in all of the more Jewish high schools. And he was one of the consultants to the organization. But more important, he was head of the Camp Avodah, a Jewish camp. It started out as Victory Farm volunteers. That's what we did during World War II. Went out and picked all kinds of fruit and tilled the soil. He was kind of advanced in his thinking, wanted Jewish youth in Chicago to get a sense of chalutzim, of what was going on in Israel, and created this summer camp, which was a work camp. We actually got paid, it was about 12 cents an hour, but we got paid to do work for local farmers. This was Jewish kids on the farm.
Wow. And
his background, he was the son of a rabbi, but he was not a religious man, but he was very social, active, oriented. He stimulated us. About 6 of my colleagues at that time, my age, my peers, became rabbis, as an example. And one of the mottos that I remember still from those days was, "Nothing Jewish shall be alien from me." And that's what kicked me off.
That's a great story. Any other experiences in your life that encouraged you to commit yourself besides?
Well, obviously my history in Germany and the fact that I'm a product. Some say I'm a survivor. I don't call myself a survivor. I think that term should be reserved for people who really survived. But by definition of the Shoah Foundation, I am a survivor because they interviewed me. But clearly, the 1930s and our departure, but more important, what I saw and heard in my household as I was growing up, where my parents became more and more aware of what was going on for those of our family that remained behind, just created a tremendous pressure on my views of life and my ways of thinking about my Jewishness. And
you were about 8 years old when you
I
left
was 8 years old when I came.
When you left Germany and came to the United States?
Yes, to Chicago.
So you were old enough to understand some of the things that were happening around you.
Well, they were happening to me in school.
What happened to you in school?
Well, we were identified as Jews, and this is kind of a silly thing to say, but we couldn't, at the morning session opened, we were not allowed to say Heil Hitler. Well, looking back, I'm happy about that.
Thanks God.
But we were not very welcome. My Christian friends soon disappeared. We were not allowed to go to the swimming pool. We couldn't go to the parks. We were not allowed to go to the movies. And we saw around us the persecution that was beginning in my early memory. But more important, when my father could no longer carry on his business, which was with the farming community, it became clear we had to leave. Of course, I didn't realize at the time how serious all this was or is going to be.
Of course. So let's fast forward and let's talk about the organizations that you're involved with. Give us some examples of your favorite where you have a passion for?
Well, during my business career, it was my relationship to the computer community in Israel. I was invited by Golda Meir to be chairman of a computer committee in 1971, and headed up a international conference for data processing in Israel, in Jerusalem. And since then, I've been going back, not recently, but in those earlier years, I've been going back many times. I've been there maybe 20 times and dealt with the business community for the most part. I also served a 4-month stint in consulting to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry on the evolution, this was 1977, the evolution of electronic data processing in Israel, what they might do in order to exploit locally and from an export point of view, this new data processing industry.
More Making a Difference after this.
I've read that you've been involved with several books.
Well, my first book was a technical book on software economics, what it takes to build software and what are the financial aspects to it from a profit and loss statement point of view. But my passion after retirement was genealogy, and I wrote a over 900-page book on the history of my family, and fortunately I found 35,000 names of relatives. This goes back 800-900 years.
How could you possibly do that?
There's only one reason for being able to do it, because the 30 Years' War is a barrier for most people to go beyond. Right. I tapped into a rabbinical family, a dynasty that went to the 14th century. A well-known Rabbi Jacob Weil, who was connected through his wife, and hence also one of my forefathers, Rabbi Meir, the Maharam of Rothenburg, well-known Talmudic scholar from the 13th century. And this was because of all of the writings that the rabbis did, the responsa of answering letters. And
the letters you sent out, they all responded and gave you the information to put together that
and gave information about themselves from a genealogical point of view. And I was able to track that family to the present, of course, and that's what a good part of the book is about.
Fascinating. I just can't imagine going back that far with all the obstacles you have, a number of wars, and the Jews being ostracized.
Well, the story doesn't end there, because I'm currently towards the end of writing what I hope to be my best work, and that is a memoir of my family members that were victims of the first deportation of Jews that is very, very little known, especially in the United States, because it happened in October 1940, 2 years before, or a year and a half before the massive deportations to the East. This was a deportation to the West.
Yeah, out of Germany.
Out of Germany, southern part of Germany, Baden and Saar and the Pfalz. 6,500 Jews were woken up one morning, October 22nd, and given 2 hours to pack one suitcase each and be ready for deportation, not knowing where they were going. Turned out they were going west, and ended up in a internment camp in the southern part of France, Vichy France, called Camp de Gurs, G-U-R-S. And I have at this point identified close to 700 of my family, blood related, that were amongst those 6,500.
700 family members. That's a lot.
And most of them ended up 2 years later in Auschwitz.
Any survivors?
Yes. My great aunt and great uncle were uniquely survivors. And the funny part about this, not the funny part, but the
Unusual.
Unexpected, they survived because they were old and sick. They were in a hospital.
At the camp?
No, outside the camp. If you were severely sick, they took you out of the camp. This was not a concentration camp. This was an internment camp. And they were fortunate in being spared the trip to Auschwitz. And they actually returned back to their home in a little town from nearby where I came from. And I visited them, myself and my wife, several times.
Are there any charities in America or our community that you're involved with today here?
Well, of course, I don't call it a charity, but my synagogue, Shomrei Torah, in West Hills, California, and most of the Jewish Federation, of course, and most of the organizations that are important in our everyday life as Jews, protecting ourselves as Jews, and the American Jewish University, where we have recently been involved in setting up a Frank Family Center.
What would you tell our young people today about the importance of giving back or the gratification of giving back to others?
Well, clearly my business activity over the years has given us a very nice return, so to speak, and it's my feeling that we owe a lot of that back to the community, and perhaps it isn't all money at all. It's more a feeling of obligation, which in a sense is what tzedakah is all about. An obligation to help and to be part of, and be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So whenever there's a need expressed, we're there to support.
Well, Werner, I want to thank you for coming today. I want to thank you for sharing your history and what you've done in your life. And I want to thank you for making a difference.
Making a Difference will return right after this.
Welcome to Making a Difference. Today we have a very special guest by the name of Phoebe Frank. She's got an interesting history and background, and I think you'll find it fascinating to hear what she's done with her life. Phoebe, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
My first question to you is, what person or people had the greatest influence on you to get involved in the community activities and giving back that you've done so well?
I'm glad you asked the question because it brings to mind a couple of very dear people in my life. Number one, it was my grandmother. I was a little girl, I was 8 years old, and my grandma had a hat store. By the way, she was second generation, but she was born in America. She had a hat store in Chicago. I was 8. I used to take the bus down to her shop, and we made hats. And she used to take me to the merchandise mart. And in the merchandise mart, they have boxes of, birds and flowers and sequins and stars and netting and things like that. And I got to take them back to her shop and put them together in a hat. So I was very proud of my hats, and one day I came back the next week and my hat was gone. She had put it in the window and my hat was gone. She said she sold it. I couldn't believe it, to think that she could sell an 8-year-old kid's hat. No way. But she said she did. I believed her. It wasn't until years later that I asked whether or not she really, really, really could have sold that hat. And I never knew the answer. But the thing is, my grandma gave me a sense of confidence that the work of my hands was good, and I believed in myself. So she started me off in a wonderful way. And then there was a very marvelous man. Well, my dad was a camp doctor in a Jewish camp for 9 years. It was called Camp Maccabee. And at Camp Maccabee, we had a very fine gentleman whose name was Ben Aronin. He was called Uncle Ben Aronin by all the kids. But he was an actor, he was a writer, he was on stage, and he had a personality like this. And we had a solarium. A solarium is a room that doesn't have window, that has lots of windows on the lake at this camp. And every Shabbos he would say, "And now it's quiet. There are no birds flying." And you know what? There were no birds flying. And the sun is setting. And you know what? The sun was setting. So he was a magical person for me. And he gave me a marvelous introduction to Judaism. And so I would say that those were the incidents that gave me a sense of who I was and the confidence to express it.
Great story. Terrific story. So let me ask you this. What organizations are you involved with or passionate towards, and why?
Well, I have one, and it's a bit of a story, but I was working on my PhD, and there was a guy in the class who said, "Oh, here's something from University of Judaism. They want a director of human services training." I didn't know.
I got to ask you a question. What, you were working on a PhD
in
what area?
psychology and counseling.
Good. I just want our viewers to know what your
Yes, in
background
psychology
is.
and counseling. And here's a sign that that some university wants a director, but I don't know myself what human services is, but I figure I'll learn. And I was angry because this guy was going to get in before me, and because they like men, and because men have more experience, blah, blah, blah. I thought my chances were very limited. So I applied anyway, and I got the job of being the director of human service training at University of Judaism. This was about 1979. And I met with a wonderful woman who also became a tremendous role model for me. And it's she who gets all the credit. Her name is Betty Wagner Kramer, and she started the counseling program called Human Service Training at American Jewish University. And I wrote a rather scholarly article about this program, but it is Betty Wagner who had the foresight to build this program.
Phoebe, tell us what the thrust of this program
Yes.
was. What was it all about?
The University of Judaism, now American Jewish University, we had in mind that there are people who may not have had college, who are interested in counseling, who might like to serve in their community as a lay person, leading groups. Perhaps it's about alcoholism, perhaps it's about dealing with the death of your spouse or child, people who are on drugs. All kinds of different groups function with a leader. And it was Betty's idea that we could train people in our community to work with these issues. The caveat being that it's a 2-year program. You cannot be a counselor without supervision. You need to have a professional. Having said that, there are all kinds of organizations that have professional supervision. For example, Red Cross, maybe in a temple it would be a rabbi, in a church it could be the priest, but someone is in charge of our people when they do the job. And so Valley Beth Shalom had a program like that. We picked up on the idea of having, and Christians too, you don't have to be Jewish to come to our program. And so this started in 1980-ish and has been functioning up till today, 2012. And after I retired, I had hired Dr. Hilary Blumfeld to be the current director. And the interesting thing is how attached people are to our program. Judy Ehrman, who was in one of our very first classes, now is our executive director. So we've placed people not only in places where people are hurting, but they are docents for Skirball and for Getty, and they do all kinds of counseling work gratis.
That's terrific. That's great.
And they're not only women, by the way. We have had a
took
few
a couple
gentlemen.
men.
Yeah, and very good at it too. So we've really enjoyed what they've done, and we're proud of every single person.
So I want to ask you another question. What would you tell young people today? Why should they get involved in programs like you did? What would you say to them?
Well, I think life is what you give it. And I believe that giving of yourself, you remember Marlon Brando? He said, I could have been a contender. I didn't just want to be a contender. I wanted to do something. And I felt that I had some gifts and some talents. And I think that when you give of yourself, you get back much more than you give. And it's my parking lot theory of life. Which is, you never know when there's going to be a parking place. All you have to do is go to the parking lot, like let's say here, and you want a certain spot. You want to park there, and you can't get in, and you go around and around. But you never know. All of a sudden, there's a parking spot right there, and you get it, and you're happy. If you hadn't suited up to come to your job, you wouldn't have gotten that parking space. Likewise, sometimes it looks like you'll never get the parking place, and then someone suddenly moves out, and you're mad at the guy in front of you because he takes the place that you had.
Right.
But then another one opens up. So you never know what is going to open up to you, how it's going to open up to you, but it does depend on you being there. And so if you're not there in life, you can't contribute. And I feel that being at the university, having a chance to talk to people, giving them a chance to see what an education can really be like. And by the way, from my point of view, teaching at the university was great. You don't have to deal with kids who don't want to be there and kids who are throwing rocks at you. This is a place where people really seem to want to learn and profit by it. So that's what gave me this vision. Be there, suit up, try it. You never know what wonderful thing could happen.
Good advice. Phoebe Frank, thank you for coming today. Thank you for suiting up and showing up.
Thank you.
And I hope you found an easy parking place. And thank you for making a difference.
Thank you for watching Making a Difference.